So welcome everyone. It's a great pleasure to welcome two amazing women to our new What is Emerging conversation series. Indra, Adnan and Anthea Lawson have both just published brilliant, excellent and very urgent new books with Perspectiva Press. Indra's book is called The Politics of Waking Up, Power and Possibility in the Fractal Age. Indra's book has been described as a beautifully crafted radical manifesto which provides hope for our troubled earth and broken politics with illuminating intensity. And it has been described also as an astonishing and deeply moving political vision, as well as a concrete roadmap to a better, more meaningful, deeply democratic, equal and awake society. Finally, someone called it a heady cocktail containing a wonderful mix of Buddhism, feminism and anarchism. And Anthea's book is called The Entangled Activist, Learning to Recognize the Master's Tools. And Bayo Akomolafa has described this book as much needed medicine, gently administered to the exhausted, bewildered figure of the modern activist. Others have called it a perspective shifting and a perspective shifting book and a manifesto for reflective activism, and as an essential manual for getting better both at activism and being human. And there's some wonderful convergences between these two books, which we will explore today, but also very interesting differences. And we're going to talk about some of the ideas Indra and Anthea explore in these works in detail today. But first, I very briefly wanted to introduce them. So Indra Adnan is the co-initiator of the Alternative UK political platform, which publishes the Daily Alternative, convenes new system actors and builds cosmo-local community agency networks, CANs, and we'll hear more about CANs in due course. And Indra is also a psychosocial therapist, a journalist, and an author. Through her work on international relations and soft power, she has consulted to the World Economic Forum, Indian and Danish governments, NATO, the Scottish Executive, and the Institute of Contemporary Arts, amongst many others. And Anthea Lawson is an activist and writer who has campaigned to shut down tax havens, prevent banks from facilitating corruption and environmental devastation, and control the arms trade. At Global Witness, she launched a campaign that changes the rules on secret company ownership and resulted in new laws in dozens of countries. And Anthea studied history at Cambridge and trained as a reporter at the Times. So my very first question for both of you is really about the core metaphors that reside at the heart of your beautiful books. And these metaphors are that of waking up and the notion of entanglement. And Indra, I wondered whether you could talk a little bit more about the idea of waking up. So waking up is a deeply resonant concept, of course, evoking Buddhism and the possibility of awakening and overcoming our illusory perceptions of self and reality. And there's also this idea of wokeness that resonates in that term. Are we all asleep now? What are we waking up from and what are we waking up to?
Yeah, thank you. And so wonderful to be in this space together with you, Anna and Anthea. Thanks so much. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation we have between us, because so much emerges from that. And waking up, it's really my contention that we've been in a revolution for the last 20 years, and which really we could correlate with the birth of the internet. And the idea of that revolution is that it's the extreme new access that people have had to information that they didn't have before, or access to each other, our ability to mobilize, our ability to connect ideas, projects. And then more than that as well, it's through social media, through platforms such as Facebook, much derided, maybe WhatsApp, our ability to see ourselves in the public sphere, many people for the very first time. So suddenly a new daily reality for people has been slowly arising through the birth of the internet. And if you live through it, you'll know the difference between, 1 year really feeling, disconnected from really what's going on in this world, or disconnected from people. How do I reach this person? used to be a very difficult task. Or how will I ever see myself in the public space? No one looking like me is out there. You know, over the course of a couple of years, suddenly all of that became possible. And that is a waking upness. Of course, it has caused a lot of new behavior, a lot of new possibilities, but it's also caused, you know, a lot of grief. And particularly for people who maybe were the most disadvantaged by the lack of access to information and each other, through this period have probably experienced the most grief and anger about discovering really that their lives, or the reason for their lives being the way that they are, is actually now more understandable. They're beginning to see, you know, who has been controlling the public space, who has been controlling the outcomes for their lives. And so, you know, that would describe what maybe we would call wokeness, you know, this real grief and anger and seizing agency at this moment. But all of us really have been in this process for the last 20 years of gradually waking up to the reality of our world.
Right, thank you. Anthea, what about entanglement? You shine a really bright light on the inner life of activism, and I think that's one of the many convergences with Indra's inquiry, and why the inner life matters. So, for example, you write, activism can be a crucible for learning how we all hold within ourselves the sickness of the structural systems we are trying to change. And I think your notion of entanglement very beautifully captures our embeddedness in our own limited cognitive frameworks and modes of perception and ways of making sense, with all their blind spots and the infinite ways in which we're shaped by our culture and psychological dispositions and traumas. So what are we entangled in? And is it possible for us to disentangle ourselves from whatever that is?
Right, yeah, so entanglement is, I was having conversations with activists. I'd been a campaigner myself. I felt like I'd run into the wall in many ways with what I was doing. Even though on the surface I was having some successes, I was getting laws changed, which counts as success in the kind of policy changing work I was doing. And I had questions about the inner life of activism that felt missing in the work I was doing. And I had questions about why is it that when we try to change the world, we so often end up recreating aspects of the problems we're trying to change. And this is something that's observed a lot from the outside of activism, with that simple question: why the hypocrisy? Why are you doing this thing that you're claiming to change? Why are you claiming to be defending people's rights whilst denying the humanity of the people that you're talking about? And so with all of these questions, I was talking to campaigners, and this sort of image of entanglement started arising. Some people used the word explicitly, some people were talking around it in different ways. And I realized that what all of these conversations had in common, with all of these threads, was that we are part of the problems we're trying to change. The systems that we're trying to change have inevitably affected us too. Now, in some ways that sounds quite obvious, but actually I think it's countercultural and it's counterintuitive in the culture at large, and particularly to activists, and particularly people who self-identify as activists. So in the culture at large, we're in a culture of individualism that tells us that we are separate from everyone and everything else, that the ground of our being is purely in us, and that we then come into relation with everything and everyone else. And I think at the deepest level that structures our perceptions. And so when we try and change the world, we think, oh right, the world is over there. It's there in the very grammar of that phrase. We're going to change. We're the subject. We're going to change the world, the object. But I think it's also very particular to a certain type of activist disposition that becomes how a lot of people who don't do activism think of activists, which is the righteousness, that location of the problem always over there in someone else. It's not us. We speak from this position of, well, we're trying to make it right, so we're okay. The problem is over there. You know, I used to explicitly think my job was to get the bastards who were responsible for running the tax havens or selling the weapons, running the arms companies, running these banks that were fueling illegal logging or whatever it is. And yeah, there are big problems with all of those things, but that framing obscures from us the ways in which we are part of the problem. So yeah, I'm saying in the book that I don't think we are going to disentangle ourselves. I think that's part of the delusion. Perhaps the greatest entanglement is that, you know, we are separate. You know, it's this idea that we are separate. We're caught up in that idea. So I think the aim is not to disentangle ourselves, it's to acknowledge it and start from a different place. I'm really curious about what it sounds like when people who are trying to change things take as their starting point that they might be part of the problem and then speak from that. What does that then elicit in the people they're speaking to?
Yeah, that would be a very radical shift, wouldn't it? To acknowledge entanglement and to leave this illusory perception, position of objectivity and outsideness. And I think, Indra, for you, this interdependence and embeddedness is also a really important point. And one of the core concepts in your book I was struck by is the idea of soft power. And I wondered whether you could talk a little bit about what soft power is and why it matters.
I mean, there's so many, you know, as Anthea was speaking, I was firing off on all cylinders, you know, because, you know, it's so right what Anthea is describing, which is this separateness of self, community, and world, you know, whereas in a sense, we all know and we all understand, if we think about it for a moment, that these are not separate beings, you know. So in politics, for example, we talk about individualists, socialists, globalists, as if they're three different constituencies. And in fact, you know, each one of us is individual. We all need to take care of ourselves, we know that, and we do it. You know, at the same time, we're completely, you know, capable and regularly think about each other. We have families, we have friends, we live in a community, and we're conscious of the world. We have our own worlds of experience, and we plan to travel the world, and we think about things from different parts of the world. So, you know, these three realms as being separate is a story about us that is perpetuated. And that really is what soft power is, in a sense. It's narrative power. You know, it's the power of a story or a way of talking about something that can be attractive enough or cause enough emotional response in people, but then draws them into relationship with something else that you might not be aware of. So let's just go back to the root of soft power. Was a term that was invented by Joseph Nye. It was just during the aftermath of the Vietnam War, when America was in a real quandary about its status. Because you know, really it felt that it was the world superpower because of its hard power. In other words, guns and money. That was the core of its claim to be a superpower. Whereas what Joseph Nye said is that no, America will always be the superpower because as well as hard power, it has soft power. And soft power is the ability to frame the reality, to create the narrative that everybody else wants to be a part of. And so, and this is what Americans call the power of attraction. Right? So the narrative is the thing that causes the attraction towards you. So as America was actively peddling the American dream, the idea that anybody can become president, turns out they were right. You know, everything that Hollywood tries to share as an idea of what it means to be an American, everybody wants to be a part of that. And so that power of attraction draws people towards America. America then makes a relationship with everybody on the basis of that, and then has power over them, right? Through this power of attraction, they were selling the growth economy and the military-industrial, you know, the military-industrial narrative, and in fact, military industry. Everything that you know about America's hard power is sold through this soft power corridor of relationship with you. So we have to be constantly aware of what are the stories that are governing our way of seeing the problem and being in the problem. What does it say about us? And when we buy into those stories, what have we then become a part of? And in our case, you know, one of the key things I was trying to identify in the book is, you know, this idea of Homo economicus. You know, we've been sold the story, you know, we're believing, or our political systems worldwide want us to believe that we are basically material human beings that need a roof over our heads and a tax cut. And that's all that politics has to deliver. Whereas in fact, you know, we are what I would call biopsychosocial spiritual entities. And we have to redesign our societies along those lines. As long as you remain Homo economicus, you are subject to the growth economy, which is destroying our planet. I mean, it's, you know, it's a heavy thing to be the object of someone else's soft power.
I love the term of biopsychosocial spiritual entities. It just captures it all so neatly. Yeah, and I think this idea of noticing stories, myths, belief systems in operation, and then shaping them differently, and, you know, creating new metaphors and imaginaries is a really crucial part of our work. Anthea, I was very struck by how honestly and openly you talk about anger in your book, and you also mentioned this idea of, you know, getting the bastards, and that it was very much a, you know, strong driving force for you, and so anger, I think, is a really interesting phenomenon, you know, this energy driver, motivating force, but also as a problem, you know, as something that can thwart the inner life, that can distort it, or that can make us act in dangerous, non-rational ways. And I think I would love to hear a tiny little bit more about activist anger, and whether you think anger is necessary, or a liability, or a kind of strange mixture of both of these.
I think it's all of them. I think it's also inevitable. And it's inevitable, particularly when people are doing activism for the conditions of their own life, when their activism is springing from the conditions of their lived experience. Anger is an inevitable response to the trauma that anyone might have suffered under the existing systems of power. And so the point here is not to be saying anyone's anger in any particular situation is not the right thing to be doing. I don't think anyone is in a position to comment on anyone else's anger in some ways. And I think it's really important to say that first. And yet I found myself getting very curious about my own anger, because some of it was not in conditions where I was speaking about what I was fighting for in my own life. I suppose any activism that I've done from my own lived experience would be feminist campaigning, because of my experience of being a woman, a white woman specifically in the world. But I've done a lot of campaigning also that has been, in the broadest sense, in support of the rights of other people. And I would get very, very angry about those things as well. I'd get myself sort of massively wound up. I write in the book about how easy it was for people to sort of wind me up at parties, by you know some annoying blokes of being the controversialist, and they could see they'd get a massive explosion out of me. And I got to the point where I had to sort of stop doing that because it was so exhausting to me. And in the process of writing this, I was and in hearing from other campaigners, and also in speaking to psychotherapists and psychologists, I was starting to realize how easy it is to bring anger from other times and other places. And it wasn't like there was a specific one for me. I've always been just quite a fighty person. I've always been a bit sort of, you know, like that. When I discovered I could kind of like talk fast and sort of have a go at things when I was in my teens, that became part of my personality. And so I brought all of that energy to what I was doing. And yeah, okay, some people, in some cases it was effective. Sometimes people told me I was absolutely terrifying. But in some cases, I suspect it was far too much. Now, one of the things that gets observed about anger from the outside is the way that activist anger can be very off-putting to people. And again, we have to look at this carefully. Are you getting put off by activist anger because you're feeling defensive about what they're saying? Are you feeling defensive about your own implication in the problem? You know, all of those questions come in when somebody is responding to activist anger. And at the same time, there may well be situations where when we're speaking from that sort of heightened place, it does make us less likely to be heard, because we are speaking to humans who, like us, have a nervous system that will be triggered by that anger. And a lot of people are going to go into a place where they can't hear. It puts them in a fear state, or it just makes them want to go like that. And they don't want to hear it. So I think it is something we've got to look at. And particularly in the situations where it might not be anger specifically for the issue in question. And so I wanted to really kind of complicate these questions and dig around in them for all those reasons.
Yeah, and you also wrote a fascinating topic on chapter on shadow work, and how, you know, past anger and past experience can get mingled up and entangled in the present and blur, you know, the clarity of vision there. And I've also wondered whether anger is related to burnout, which is another big topic in your book. You know, you talk about a lot of activists suffering from burnout, and I think it has also been one of your personal experience. And so I just wondered whether you could talk a little bit more about burnout, and whether it, you know, is a big issue in the field.
Yeah, I would say it is. In all of the, I mean, there are many spheres of campaigning I've not worked in, but in all of the ones that I have, it is a big topic. People burn out, and they burn out in different ways. I've worked in places where it wasn't sort of acceptable to say that you burnt out, and so everybody would get repetitive strain injuries and couldn't use their keyboard. You know, it is anyone who's done any kind of campaigning knows people who've burnt out, knows people who are trying to avoid it. There are movements where it's more explicit looking at it. There are places where it's sort of completely denied until things go wrong. Now I think some of that is like the practical reality of what you're up against. The practical reality of the way that power operates in the world is that you're always going to be very small against something very big. You know, even when you can get people together in big social movements, which doesn't happen often on that kind of scale, there's still that risk. But in the way that it works with sort of small groupings and organisations, it's almost sort of inevitable under the sort of current ways that it happened, that things kind of come up and there's a big sort of swelling, and then the sort of first bunch of people kind of go, oh right, okay, how do we keep that going? Some more people come in and try and keep it going, and people are always dropping off. I think the idea of using anger as a motivational tool, if it is going to be there and if it is going to last, it's like, let's think about a fire and the way that a fire burns. You can put some kind of like stuff on that makes a fire blast up very quickly, and it's not going to last. I think anger that has sort of burnt down into something that becomes commitment and kind of and sort of passion to do it, but without being those sort of roaring flames that will consume you as well, then fine, that might be part of the motivational mix for some people. But the kind of speaking from that all the time, nobody can do that. It's completely exhausting. So yeah, I think the two are closely linked, and perhaps we'll get on later to some of the stuff that's about you know, avoiding burnout and where that comes in.
Yeah, and it's also, of course, a consequence of, you know, the more idealistic your work is, the more likely you are to burn out when the results are not immediately visible or not as great as you hope they would be. Indra, your book is very, very optimistic.
Yeah.
I thought that your book was full of hope and full of positive examples of people who are already changing the world right now in lots of numerous ways. And I just wondered whether you could talk a little bit more about these techniques they might be using, and the idea of cosmolocalism.
Yeah. I mean, I sort of want to pick up on where Anthea left off there, because I think the experience that she's describing, you know, doesn't drop away when you've got a new idea, or you know, and it's really the segue, if you like, between having to stand against something when it becomes really clear that that thing is not okay, and then standing for something is quite a subtle shift of energy, and you can take some while for that to emerge, you know, and I think that even in the best of you know, communities, you know, your own family, your own friends, how that energy shifts I think we were discussing it just the other day, Anthea, about how I remember very clearly how many years I felt that I was permanently on the defense as a woman, you know, a politician moving into a political system that was designed by men. And whatever I said was received as either marginal or irrelevant or small or, you know, self-interested. And I was permanently on the defense. So often people would like reject what I was saying. But nowadays I find more and more having beginning to occupy a new position because we did launch the alternative as an alternative, right? So what our premise was only 2% of people are members of political parties. You know, what's happening with the 98%? If you look outside of the political bubble, you'll see people are doing something else. You know, the answers to the solutions are already there, right? And let's examine those. And so for 4.5 years, we've created this platform that really highlights and champions new solutions to problems. So it may look positive from that point of view, but still within it are the same dynamics of a system that is trying to shift from reacting to the past and trying in a sense to rescue ourselves from the past, I'm talking in a personal way, to really being able to hold a vision for the future and stand behind that. And I think that what's happened for me personally over the years with gaining or creating more ground there, I have myself begun to feel more positive because I can stand for something that I can point at. You know, before I used to stand almost as a sort of objection to what I saw. Something else is surely possible. But now after 4.5 years, I can say this and this and this and this. I feel stronger. And now the strange thing is that so many people who will listen, political people I was involved with, they now are constantly on the defense. You know, I recognize it because I recognize the language. I used to use that language. And I would say the same with a lot of, I'm entering into dangerous territory, but, you know, quite often with men now, instead of me trying to be, you know, and listen to me, I feel much more solid than I used to because of this work that we've done for 4.5 years. And that it is distinctly feminine and feminist, whatever way you want to describe women moving into the space. And I feel that I've put a lot of men on the defensive now. And that's interesting to observe. You know, it's the dynamic is shifting. So I would say positive is a tricky word, Anna, because people think positive as somehow optimistic, you know, meaning, you know, a reaction to danger or a reaction to something being complicated or uncomfortable. Let's be positive about it. But actually, it's a hard fought position after 4.5 years of noticing what's been excluded from the public narrative, that there are many, many ways forward for us. You asked about cans just briefly. Cans is a generic term that describes groups of people coming together, mostly place-based, deciding that they are going to invest in themselves and each other to find solutions for the place that they live in, whatever the politicians are doing. So, you know, even if they won't take on, you know, the emergency the way we want them to, we're going to do it here. And when we first started building these, thinking we needed to design them and prototype them, we quickly saw that other people have been doing that for decades already. So whether you're talking about transition towns or eco-villages or commoning or forms of cooperatives, these cans, you know, are a phenomenon of human behavior, people coming together, you know, often systemically, thinking deeply about what they can do for the place they live in and beginning to make that happen. What is different now in this era of waking up is that they can see each other. They can hear that each other are sharing practice, developing new tools, having results. And that's what I call fractal. This is what I call the fractal age, where you see patterns of behavior occurring all over the place. You didn't have to centrally organize for that to happen. It's popping up everywhere. And once you see it, you can replicate quickly. You can copy and replicate. You can take the bits you like, you can leave the bits you don't like behind. This is fractal emergence as I see it. And cosmolocalism, just quickly, is the difference between globalism and cosmolocalism is that once upon a time, it's probably still mostly now, people talk about the need to bring the global into the local or to have some relationship, or that the local has to somehow fit itself to the global to be realistic. And now, because of this waking upness and this global commons and because of the internet, you can have the whole of the global system operating effectively in your local community. You don't have to wait for it to, to come down to you. You don't need to make a relationship with it, one large, one small. Systemically, it can appear where you are, whether it's in the form of what's the word for it now? Where you can literally download plans and make them happen in your own space. You can do whatever somebody's doing in Africa, you can be doing it, in Devon. That is cosmolocalism.
Yeah, it's a beautiful concept, this idea of sharing good practice, really, and benefiting from blueprints from all over the world, and the internet making them visible and shareable. And
3D printers, that's what I wanted to say. Through a 3D printer, you can literally just make something happen in your local environment that's happening in Harvard or, Taiwan, whatever.
Yeah. Can I pick up on something Indra just said there? Because I feel like this brilliant example of the cans that you've been sort of behind setting up, I think it really illustrates the difference between so Joanna Macy's really helpful here. She's someone who's teaching. I really recommend. She's written lots of books, and there are lots of people trained in her work that reconnects as a way of supporting sort of activist burnout and finding a way to act through grief from the situation we're in. But she talks about the great turning, as she calls it, that's required to a more just and ecologically sane society. And she talks about the 3 types of actions that are required. There's the holding actions, which is the great classic no of protesting activism and what lots of people think activism is. And then the second bit is exactly what Indra's talking about. It's the creation of new alternatives. I was really struck by a line in your book, Indra, and I was reading it this weekend. You said, unless you step right in and immerse yourself in the transformation, it will remain only a distant hope for you. Like there's some real sort of digging where you stand kind of feeling about that I personally, and I've met a lot of other people now who have found that when they have burnt out through sort of hurling themselves against this rock face of the systems that are concentrating on using their agency to create something can be very energizing. And then thirdly, there's the kind of inner work, the underpinnings, and this is what we're both talking about, this kind of interplay between the inner work in ourselves in order to be able to engage differently and the outer work of the politics that underpins all of those change. Now that's brilliant, and that's a really helpful framing, and it can show sort of how you can re-energize yourself by moving to moving to a different spot in this kind of movement ecology of actions. I, at a point of burnout with hurling myself against policy rocks, have found sort of renewed energy in turning to investigating and writing about the inner underpinning, for example. And I now feel I'm moving back into some more kind of oppositional stuff with a bit more energy, which is really interesting. The problem is we can't all turn away, I think, from the great no, because there are some things that do just need stopping. Particularly at the moment, politics is moving to the right. The far right is on the rise. Its thinking and practices are visible in elected governments, including in our own country. And so there are some very big no's that still need saying, which is where the kind of underpinning of thinking about what we are bringing of ourselves to that work really helps support it. I mean, I was really struck by these kind of correspondences, this entanglement of burnout as, well, look, here we are working flat out to change the structures of an economic system based on endless growth to stop it burning the planet out. And here we are burning ourselves out, trying to stop that because we're entangled in its practices and its ways of working and all of the kind of like Protestant work ethic or, guilt things or whatever it is that motivates you to your work. These quite old stories. you know, like
Absolutely.
those entanglements like really have got us working in the system's own ways in order to try and stop it. And yeah, of course we're going to burn out.
Absolutely. And I would say I was, you know, it was very interesting because I wrote the book originally as a series of 12 blogs, which were trying to sum up what I'd learned in the alternative. But my editor, Mina Salami, who is also part of the Emergent network, you know, said there's something missing from your book. You need to tell us who you are, you know, and why did you even start thinking about these things? So then I put a chapter at the beginning, which was about my own story. And when I reconnected with my own story, I realized that really not a single thing that I was pointing at, I hadn't actually experienced myself personally in some way. And one of the biggest things, Anthea, was what you've just described, you know, but for me, I refer to it as coming off the map and onto the territory. You know, I'd lived the life of the mind for a long time and really hid in that space, you know, because it was safer. And, you know, I dropped down onto the territory. So in a way, I was talking about how the world should change, what needs to happen, what people need to do, all of that sort of language. And then every now and then I drop down into the space of being involved in something directly, not really liking it, and coming back up to that theory space again, you know. And at some point, it was around the London Integral Circle for 10 years. And it hit a crisis, actually, after about 6 years, where the women separated from the men. And it was because of our frustration. This is not something that only men do, but this is how it came to a head, with this obsession with what Ken Wilber meant when he said X, you know, or looking at pre-trans fallacy. What does that mean? Page 22, you know, and this month after month trying to argue and debate what Wilber meant and what Claire Graves meant and what Reverend Kagan meant, you know. And at some point, the women stepped away and said, you hear that? Stepped away and said, no, we want to live this in real life. In a sense, we don't care anymore. I want to think about what Ken Wilber meant anymore. I want to feel it in my blood. You know, what does integral theory do for me? How does it help me in my daily life? How does it make me a different person? You know, and then that was it, really. After that shift, I committed myself again to the territory rather than to the map. And it was, you know, an important, you know, path to doing the alternative, because so much of the time I'd spent in political think tanks thinking about what needs to happen, what should happen. And for another time, maybe questioning this left-rightness of our politics and how much of that is part of our internal divisions and our internal narratives, you know, because I think it describes very well the dynamics of different forms of agency. But to what extent can we actually hold those different forms of agency, each one of us internally, I think is quite an important challenge for politics.
Yeah, and I think I found that was one of the reasons why your book was so convincing as well, you know, because I think readers get a very strong sense of you being passionately involved and engaged in all the positive examples you share with the reader, and that they, you know, that they work and that they exist and that they're out there, and that they can have an effect. And I guess it's a matter of gaze and perspective, you know, but at the same time, I think you also always, you know, were very aware of the broader system and the systemic problems that weren't being addressed by these initiatives. So it was a nice shifting from positive, hope-inspiring examples towards, you know, towards the broader problematics of the system. And I guess the view of what is working and what is emerging and what is happening and popping up, all those fractals, is very important for not burning out and for not losing hope. And I found that very, very powerful, you know, to read. Yeah. And sorry, Anthea, I just wanted to ask you about, you know, this paradox at the heart of your book, on which you reflect very, very openly and consciously, and that's this idea that in order to be an activist, you need certainty and firm moral convictions about what is right and wrong, and a belief in the rightness and efficacy of one's theory of change and action plan. It's very much a necessary condition for engaging in activism. And at the same time, you highlight in your book very, very beautifully how problematic such certainty is, and the problems that come with that kind of certainty, based on blind spots and all of the numerous, often unconscious entanglements that you outline. And I just wanted to ask you what your hopes are for the kind of entanglement conscious activism you outline, this kind of more reflective, porous, open and humble kind of activism. Can that be effective, or is there danger that we might end up just sort of hamleting about rather than taking
hamleting? I love that.
Yeah, I like that, hamleting about. Well, I'm going to come back to Indra's thing that I just read, actually. Unless you step right in and immerse yourself in the transformation, it will remain a distant hope. I feel like I'm coming across all the time people who are experimenting with this. I would say that, of course, it hasn't yet displaced what I'm increasingly thinking of as there's a sort of societal activist script that when somebody first turns to activism, particularly if it's in reaction to something, you adopt the script. And the script says, I'm right and they're wrong. The script has kind of righteousness embedded into it. It's got some purity embedded into it. We're good because we're doing it. This goes throughout left politics. It goes throughout a lot of the public sector as well. It's baked in, I think, to some of the polarizing divides in society more broadly, but it's really strong on the, I want to call it a front line. I like to try and get away from military terminology, but there is a line that gets drawn when somebody speaks as an activist, because the person they're speaking to, if they are got that fellow feeling of feeling, oh yes, I also am someone who will speak out in this way, they sort of become the, let's call it the not activist, for the sake of understanding this dynamic. And across that line, all sorts of projections are flying. The activist is sort of saying, yes, I'm really pure, and the other person might not be right. None of this consciously. It's just sort of in there. There's disgust. Almost every subject I've ever worked on, at some point when we're talking about what we're going to do, people are huffing and puffing, saying, well, that's disgusting. We must do something about that. They're so disgusting. How could they do that? That is disgusting. It's like, wow, that's a massive projection out across the line. And then, of course, the projections come the other way. It's like, look at the responses when people take the knee, when Extinction Rebellion are sitting in the road. They're all of that stuff comes from a mixture of sort of denial, not wanting to look at complicity, not wanting to look at your own stuff, kind of, wanting to make those uncomfortable feelings go away. So all that's kind of baked into that activist script. So yes, we could say, this is a sort of, another idealistic prescription, right? If you come up with another idealistic prescription that we're going to kind of change activism. And one of the things I was wrestling with in writing this book is, hold on, I've stepped out of the activism I was doing. I've stopped shouting at CEOs and trying to get op-eds in the FT for a bit in order to think about this. But I'm finding myself risking, if I'm not careful, becoming an activist on behalf of the view of activism that I want to talk about. So there were all sorts of entanglements with my own sort of inbuilt activist method in my way of writing. And so when I was writing about not wanting to sound, how activists might not want to sound quite so certain about what they're doing, at least not that certainty that comes from the wrong place, that certainty that comes from trying to convince yourself, that certainty that comes from trying to find your own sense of meaning in a completely alienated world, and trying to step away from that certainty to something more grounded. Maybe I'm trying to do that. I had to work to find a voice that spoke with sufficient authority on this, that it will land, and yet doesn't do that kind of projection of, hey, I've got the answer, everyone, come on, we all need to do this. I suppose I want to see it as an invitation. I want to see it as sharing the voices of people I've heard from who are saying very compelling things, in my view, about this way of viewing activism differently, and speaking from my own experience, because sometimes telling our own stories is the most powerful way we can reach people, you know, rather than doing sort of third person policy, blah, you know, here's the theory about why I think this will work. I'm telling a very personal story in some places about how I've, you know, how that has changed things for me. And so I think this paradox about the certainty, I think it becomes, the paradox kind of dissolves slightly when we see that what sounds like certainty, and the certainty I'm encouraging people not to have, is actually not really certainty, it's overcompensation. So it's all about where we're coming from. If we're not coming from this place of slight overreach, you know, in the broader sense, of not projecting, not trying to kind of reclaim these sort of, well, sorry, not projecting, and perhaps speaking more from a kind of reclamation of the bits of ourselves that we've, you know, not wanted to own up to. We're coming from such a different place that the certainty is something that, it sounds different. We all know that feeling on the odd occasion, and there are not many people embodying this. This is one of the problems. We don't have mentors in this. There are not many people in the public sphere who we can truly point to, particularly elders, where we can say, wow, that person is speaking from that place sort of dropped in themselves, where you know, you can hear that it's completely congruent, and they're not kind of straining their voice to say something that I can't quite believe because their voice isn't congruent with what they're saying. So, and this brings in the other paradox that's completely interwoven, which is that it's only by attending to ourselves that we can stop putting ourselves first. You know, the form of activism that I think people react to is it ultimately, it sounds like it's about us. It's us shouting really, really loudly, and somehow putting ourselves at the center of it, you know. And so I write a lot about the savior stance that people can adopt. But the irony is we do have to attend to ourselves a bit in order to not be starting with ourselves. So yeah, it felt like there were paradoxes baked throughout the whole project, really.
Yeah. And I just wanted to, just wanted to say this is also one of the points where your books beautifully overlap. You know, this nexus between I, we, world, and the importance of attending to our inner lives, and how that actually then shapes how we shape or try to shape the outer world. And I just wanted to ask both of you, because you have both read each other's books, where you think you most agree, and on what points you see a real kind of you know, congruence of vision, and where you might disagree.
Gosh, the second one is hard because and let me start with the first one myself, because just picking up on what Anthea just said, I think she's given this great landscape in the, you know, for, you know, holding things lightly, you know, and you know, being able to take what I call in my book responsibility, or develop responsibility, meaning the ability to respond to what we all know is, you know, multiple crises. We can't afford to put our passions away. We need this energy, but we have to be increasingly aware of what are the master's tools. You know, how much are we in somebody else's narrative as we're responding to the crisis? How much was that how much were we manipulated to think about it in this way? You know, and I think one of the things that we obviously have in common here, you know, and obviously with the listeners as well, Anna, is this integral idea, you know, of the multiple forms of agency. For me, this is very important. Not only that you always have to remember who you're talking to, you know, when you're saying what you're saying. It does require you to stop for a second and think, who am I talking to now? And what kind of agency does that person imagine that we have? You know, rather than blast them with you know, as if all kinds of power is the same, or all kinds of agency is the same. It's not. You know, we have to know who we're talking to, but also to be able to reach into yourself with these multiple forms of agency. You know, I've got an angry self. You know, I've got a very red self. I've got a very blue self. I've got a very green self. At any point, you know, I can channel a different kind of way of talking about what I think is possible. I think maybe even just in this conversation, the only thing that maybe, we could still, and I'm sure we wouldn't disagree for long, but just around this, what is the current reality and the left, right, and the rise of the right. I'm increasingly in the world of that's not the truth, that it isn't a left-right divide. And what we're seeing arising for me is a certain prioritizing of a form of agency, that is to do with emotional manipulation and, only highlights the degree to which people are waking up. So, whether they're Trump supporters or conspiracy theorists, increasingly I'm beginning to think of these people as slowly waking up rather than the right. So, again, I think, I'm sure that, we would come to an agreement, because in fact, Anthea's book would totally support what I'm saying as well. So in that respect, back to you, Anthea. Let's find something to fight about, for God's sakes.
Well, I'm not sure I can fight about it really, because I think they're both true, right? I think what you're saying about, it's actually about something else is true. And I think actually it's also true that this is happening in the world right now.
Yeah.
And it's having some pretty scary effects already. And we need to really think about how we best respond to that, because of course the way that whole sphere of governance, if we can call it that, works is it operates on fear. So one of the things I was really struck by, there were many correspondences I felt in what we're looking at, but it's this sense of agency. That's what I really noticed. That's like one of them. I think that's the message that came through most powerfully from your book. You were saying you might think that the whole system is set up to tell people, hold on, you don't have any agency, whether it's politics or the way the media works. I really liked your description of the way that, let's call it, the billionaire press that's my terminology, not yours, is meeting our emotional needs for security by giving us this constant download of, what our leaders are saying, even if it's total cobblers. But, it's that constant kind of churn, and that's keeping us kind of in thrall to the machine in different kinds of ways. And you're saying, look, actually, switch off some of that. Look at what we're putting out every day. Look at these stories. It's happening already. It's there. It's all around you. And I think one of the things that I have wanted to do is not only to speak to people who self-identify as activists about, about all the things that I do want to speak about, how to avoid burnout, all these questions that are pressing for activists. How can we be less righteous? How can we avoid burnout? How can we avoid replicating what we're seeking to change? But I'm also very interested in speaking to people who more generally are growing in awareness of what's going on in the world, troubled about it, and want to do something, but don't like the look of what they think activism is. And so they think, well, I don't want to do that. And so the perception of activism, the activist script that is held in common across this line that gets drawn when an activist speaks, that's held in common by people who call themselves activists and people who don't, and people who are reacting to it, that script is yet another impediment to people fulfilling their agency, in addition to some of the ways that you're talking about, the way that politics and the media and so on works, and arguably education, we could continue about agency and how it's formed and restricted. And so I'm really interested by kind of unpicking some of these notions that are kind of in the activist script. I'm interested in opening up the idea of agency to people who might not call themselves activists. And when I speak about it, I get interesting responses each time I speak about it. Somebody usually comes up afterwards and says, oh, right, I've realised there's something I can do. I hadn't thought of myself as an activist. And either I will or I won't call myself that, but there is something I can do. I was so struck by people's, because I asked people sort of when I interviewed them, to talk about how they felt, how they would describe what they're doing, what is it, and how would you define it? And one person said it's a realised sense of agency, and that sort of encapsulates it in a really nice way, I think. So yeah, I think there's some real correspondences here in how we're talking about it.
Yeah, I had a sense that both of you very much celebrate and emphasize agency and believe in it and trust in it and that it matters and show ways in which it can be enhanced and put to work. And I just wanted to conclude by asking you about this idea of the personal and the political, because I think both of you interweave the personal and the political really elegantly and powerfully in your books. And I think that's partly what makes them so, not just intellectually convincing and hard-hitting, but also touching and moving and just they come with an authority that comes from somewhere very deep. And I think you both show and don't tell, how the political and the personal hang together. And I just wanted to ask you what, for you, the most personally transformative insight is that you have gained during your involvement in politics and activism and in those spheres where the two overlap, of course, because they're very closely related in numerous ways.
Would you like to go first, Indra?
After you, Anthea. It's still, I get this kind of fireworks happening when I'm asked what is the most, and I think there's a number of things, but I mean, I'm happy to talk. I'm happy to say that it took me a while for the penny to drop that that the reason our politics is so dysfunctional, and please forgive me, anybody who thinks this is it's a personal realization, right? So I'm not making massive claims, but for myself, that that not only politics but most of our institutions, were designed in a period where only men were in the public space. That men had all the power, and they designed the institutions and developed the culture and the bureaucracy, if you like, that now still have power, and that over a century maybe, but certainly over the last 20 years, the way that women have appeared in the public space has really opened up completely new, what I would call ontological possibilities for power. So this idea that power could feel quite different from the way it feels in these institutions. And that's something that I've been growing into, and I think of it as a yin-yang thing, but I also feel that it's the reason why the arts are so important, and why everything that women have actually over those centuries have been developing in the private space now can emerge into the public space and hold ideas of power and connectedness that were always there but were not visible. That is something to do with women moving into the public space. And I didn't grow up, I didn't have a feminist upbringing, meaning my father is Indonesian Muslim, my mother is Dutch Catholic. I was quite complacent in a way about my feminine self, or my female self, however you want to describe it. And it's not really until these recent years that I've come to see specifically that it is women that bring the wholeness of things, that it is women that bring, the whole human experience into new institutions. That's recent for me, but it gets stronger every day. And it's women that will include the men and in that new space, and not make it an either or. They won't exclude the men, let's put it that way. So yeah, that's been my realization.
Beautiful, thank you, Indra. I love this, the way you describe this, private insights emerging into the public space and transforming it, and how that movement sort of creates a paradigm shift that is becoming ever more visible. Thank you. Anthea.
I'd love to pick up loads of things Indra said there, but I think we need to book in an entirely separate conversation to do that. I was really struck, by the way, just the way that your book finished and got on exactly that note. All the time when women were the technology we were looking for.
Yes.
And it's all right to do that spoiler, because I just thought that was really, the way you kind of wove that point all the way through, I thought was really interesting. It feels like there are a lot of ways I could answer this question, but actually the most personal one, like the really honest one, was breaking down this kind of idea that I had, that I was doing my activism in support of other people, from a position where I was all right. Now, obviously, this needs some nuance. There is no equivalence between the damage caused to those who've benefited, and I'm a middle-class white woman, I have benefited from the systems as they are to a great extent. There's no equivalence to be drawn between the way that the systems of power affect people who benefit from them and the way that they affect people who are marginalized by them and oppressed by them. I'm not seeking to draw any equivalence. What I've realized, though, is that this idea that, once we start to realize our entanglement in the system, we realize the way that it has shaped us in really, really deep ways. In one of the later chapters, I start getting into, through conversations with psychotherapists, the ways in which some of them are seeing trauma patterns running throughout the dominant culture, running throughout the normative, successful ways of being that are kind of invisibly centered in white middle class ways of doing things in the UK and elsewhere. Like seeing the patterns in that, seeing the fight and flight patterns in that, seeing the numbness in that, and realizing the ways that some of those patterns, I noticed first the way they run through activism, the way that they could be, those patterns map onto some of what I was seeing in what I was describing of what happens in the activist space, and then realizing some of the ways that they emerge in me. Now, of course, people who have been more obviously on the receiving end of the systems of power that we are trying to change, which are hundreds of years old, will go, oh, right, okay, great, you're waking up to that. Welcome to our world, we know this. But I think it's really important that people who have been doing their activism from a position of thinking, oh, I'm here helping other people, wake up to the ways that the damage also runs through them. And I'm still learning a lot about that. And it feels like that's like the most, at the moment, that's what feels like the most profound realization that has come out of this. But yeah, there's probably 10 other answers to that question as well.
Well, that was a very beautiful and powerful one. Thank you. And I just wanted to thank both of you, Indra and Anthea, for your wonderful conversation and your wise and very profound insights that you shared today. So thank you very much. And we'll
thank you,
hopefully hear from you again.
Thank you so much, Anna. Very enjoyable. Thanks.
Yes.
Anthea, we'll keep talking.
Yes, I've enjoyed the conversation. We'll definitely keep going. All right.
Thank you.